someone who helps companies scale up, who helps CXOs do better. He's a C-level coach. He's a C-level consultant, and he helps individuals and organizations on transformational strategy. Let me welcome Mr. Sangeet Paul Choudary, who's the author of a book that a lot of CXOs could read and hopefully learn some latest techniques to be able to scale up, but also revisit some of the things that we forget in doing our day-to-day jobs. So let me bring in Sangeet Paul Choudary into the conversation. Welcome, Sangeet. And Deepak and team, I would like you to show the poster of the book so that our viewers and readers can get a sense of the book. It's about scaling up. So if we can show the cover of the book. Mayank and Deepak, if we can show the cover of the book.
Sure, sir.
Sangeet, let me tell our viewers, Sangeet is joining us from Singapore. While he studied at IIT Lucknow and I'm Bangalore, he moved to Singapore many, many years back, and he does his work from Singapore. So let me first start by while Mayank and Deepak show the cover of the book, and normally it doesn't take that much time for the cover to come up, but maybe today it's taking more time. But Sangeet, let me start by asking you, I wanted to show the cover of the book, but let me start by asking you, the book is called Platform Scale for a Post-Pandemic World. So it couldn't have been a better book because really the pandemic has provided us an opportunity to scale up. This is the book. It has a lovely cover. Monday, I was traveling to Bhopal from Delhi, and I saw a young entrepreneur, 29 years old, second generation in his business, reading the book on the flight. It was heartening to see the quest for knowledge and transformation in a young second generation entrepreneur. So first of all, Sangeet, let me ask you, how have been the last 11, 12 months for you, both personally and professionally?
Yeah, I think thank you, Annurag, and thank you for having me on the on this webinar and this session. I think it's been an interesting period for all of us, and the reason I kind of brought out this book. I first wrote, my first book, Platform Scale. This is my third book. My first book was Platform Scale, which I published in 2015. And I realized last year that a lot of things were fundamentally changing, because of which how we think about platforms needs to be revisited in the context of how those ideas will apply in a post-pandemic world. And so really the idea behind this book over the last 12 months or so has been to kind of almost rewrite the text of what I first wrote to update it to how things are going to change when we emerge into this post-pandemic world. And I'm happy to go through some of those themes of what I really believe are happening, because of which the idea of digital platforms and platform business models is becoming much more important. To your point about how have things changed professionally and personally? I think personally, we've all now have this new shared alternate life on remote collaboration tools like the one that we're using right now. Our sense of space has completely been changed. Our sense of relationships has changed a lot, because the relationships we would not have engaged in the past because of locational constraints have now been reignited. Certain other relationships that were strong because of locational advantages have become weaker. So a lot of things of that sort have changed. Those of us who've been successful enough to redesign our life around these changes, we've emerged stronger out of it. So it's been an interesting point of really rethinking what every aspect of life means once some basic elements like this change. Now, if I just take one aspect of what I talk about in the book, I talk about actually in the first chapter something very relevant to how things are changing in a post-pandemic world. And my point over there is that periods of massive and sudden change, like the pandemic, these periods are they trigger two kinds of shifts. They either trigger a shift in demand patterns, so the way the market behaves, the way consumers, what consumers do, fundamental shifts in demand patterns happen. For example, you would go and buy things at your kirana store, now you order online. And you used to order standardized goods like books and CDs online, but you would not have ordered groceries online in the past. But now that shift happened, or shift to remote healthcare happened. So it talks about demand side shifts, but then it talks about supply side shifts as well. And the point that it makes is that when demand side shifts and supply side shifts are combined, even if the things return to normal, business would fundamentally change, because the combination of the two leads to massive shifts in value. And I'll give one example of that. A shift in demand side is that instead of going to the theater, I watch a movie on Netflix. But a shift on the supply side is that theaters had this ongoing relationship with movie studios, that they would have a release window during which the movie could not go to a streaming platform. Now that window has completely been eroded because of the pandemic, and that negotiation power goes down dramatically. Even if things go back to normal, we start going back to movie studios. If by that time streaming companies have established a good business model for movies to be released directly on streaming, that relationship would have been transformed forever. So a key point that I talk about is that platforms, and I'll go into that in more detail, help us reorganize these two shifts together to take us towards permanent change. So I'll just pause there. So, but that's one of the key ideas about how to think about the post-pandemic world.
Can I play contrarian, and Sangeet?
Sure.
I agree to most of what you say, and there is no question about the direction and the momentum of this platform scale, so to say, if I have to use the term of your book. But let me say, how would you respond to if I were to say to you that the more technology grows, the more virtual grows, and I keep saying we're in a 3C economy: a collaborative economy, a compassionate economy, and a contactless economy, right? But the more the virtual grows, the contactless economy grows, the value of human touch becomes more premium. The value of face-to-face interaction becomes. So the beauty, it's an and economy, which means while the virtual grows, the physical will grow. Maybe it'll grow in value terms, maybe not in volume terms. So give us a sense of your thinking on that, and we'll then come back to your book.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, to answer that, let me actually start by making a distinction between, we often think of physical versus virtual as two types of media, but think of the other distinction of connected versus unconnected. You could be physical in contact, but you could be in a connected world. So the real shift that we are seeing is not a physical to a virtual shift. It's an unconnected, data poor world to a connected, data rich world. So I could be talking to you, and we,
connected, disconnected, data rich, data poor. These are the new terms, but they seem real now.
Right, exactly. So think of, you walk into a store, there's a retail assistant, she has an iPad. Now she's talking to you. There is the human touch, but she's data rich, because as she's talking, she's making notes in the iPad. She's, if you go to Sephora, for example, Sephora is a great example of that. It's a cosmetics store. The moment you go in, they do, something called the color IQ test. They do a test on your skin. They figure out what's your skin color code. And based on that, they immediately personalize the set of cosmetics that they want to recommend to you. So what's happened is now your digital identity has already been created, even though you were in a physical contact rich location, but your digital data rich identity has been created. So that's the difference. Companies that are able to move towards connected data rich experiences, that's the shift that's really important, rather than a shift from a physical to virtual. And if I take that a step further, what I talk about is the idea of platforms. Now, platforms are fundamentally a new way of organizing economic and social activity. What I mean by that is traditional economic and social activity used to be very linear, and that's what I call a pipeline. You create something, you push it out, and the market consumes it. And all of manufacturing, services, everything worked in this pipeline economy for the industrial age. What platforms do is they connect a whole range of actors to interact with each other, and they use the data of these actors to organize these interactions. So again, taking the Sephora example, for instance, that sales assistant at the store, performs an action on the Sephora platform. I go home, I log in. I mean, whoever goes to Sephora, they go home, they log in, and they see a digital profile already created with recommendations. That profile now connects into something called Beauty Talk. Sephora has a social network like Pinterest, where people share their things of interest. But now with your digital identity and the content, you now see an experience that's relevant to you, and from there you can now choose what you want to buy. That automatically gets triggered at the store, and your items get delivered. So that to me is a connected platform experience, rather than just the traditional pipeline experience of create cosmetics, push them to the store, make people buy it. So that's the fundamental shift that I believe is going to be really important as we move into this data-rich connected world.
Thank you so much, Sangeet, for giving that example. Now, let me move to your book. What was the genesis? You'd already mentioned that, the idea came in 2015 and you first wrote in 2015. But this book is for a post-pandemic world.
Yeah.
So tell us what has changed. You've given us some inputs on what has changed. You've given us an example of shopping in a beauty store and how personalization, customization, and community become important.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, the feeling of community in a virtual world, or being appreciated in a virtual world, is also real in some way. It's no longer just virtual. So give us a sense of what has changed in the last 11 months and how does it make your book more relevant, and why should a CEO read it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's a slightly longish answer, but let me come to it from 2 or 3 points. I think the short answer is fundamentally nothing has changed, and yet everything has changed, because things that were beginning to happen over the past decade, they got accelerated over the past 10 months. And that acceleration makes all these themes much more important. And sometimes acceleration is not just an increase in speed, it's something fundamentally new, because when you increase 10 things together, the combination becomes something completely new. And I'll try to go into explaining what I mean by that. To really put in context what's changed in the last 10 months, we need to understand what's brought us here to some extent. My exploration of platforms started in 2006, and then I quit my regular career in 2011 and started doing this full time. And the books started coming out in 2015, 2016, and so on. Wrote a top 10 HP article also on this topic. So all of that came out around that period. But during this period from 2006 to 2020, I would divide this into roughly 3 phases, which have been very interesting. So 2007 was a pivotal point at which technology shifted. And I'll just give a quick history because it's important to understand the present. 2007 was important because 2007 was the year when a computer stopped being something you sit at a desk to connect to and moved into our pocket when Apple launched the iPhone. That combined with another thing that was happening around the same time, Google bought something called Keyhole, which eventually became Google Maps. Once you combine Google Maps, 3G connectivity with a computer in your pocket, suddenly you had this powerful system with you that allowed you to be connected, allowed you to be data rich, allowed you to create content. And so 2007 onwards, you started seeing the rise of content rich platforms, Instagram, Pinterest, all of this started up around that time and beyond. Second, you started seeing the rise of location rich platforms like Uber, Foursquare, because combination of Google Maps, 3G, and the iPhone in your pocket allowed you to digitize your location. And the third thing that happened was Facebook opened up its identity called Facebook Connect in 2008, so that you could now log into a third-party website using your Facebook ID. For the first time, your identity became something you could now use as a passport on many different websites. That allowed the rise of companies like Airbnb, which allowed real world contact to be validated online because Facebook had already validated your identity. So if you really think of it, that set of perfect forces happened in 2007, 2008, because of which a combination of content-rich platforms, location-based platforms, I would say the sharing economy platforms like Airbnb, real-world interactions, all of that came together. And over the next 5 to 6 years, as we spent more time on these platforms, we generated a lot of data. So the second phase we kind of entered was in 2013 or so, when Google and other companies started investing in AI. Google said, we are not a mobile first company, we are an AI first company, because mobile connected the world then created the data, and AI made sense of the data. So the value has shifted from connectivity to making sense of that connectivity. And that's when a lot of value started shifting towards, how do you make sense of data? And new AI companies started coming up. And as we move forward, we've now reached a point where there are bigger shifts happening. So all of these shifts have accelerated because there are vast, portions of the economy which had their 2007 moment only in 2020. Because if I was a kirana shop, I continued to be unconnected and data poor, but 2020 forced me to become connected and data rich. And whatever happened between 2007 and 2020 accelerated for me in the next 10 months, because all of that technology was there at my disposal, whether it was me going on to something like Shopify, or me going on to a delivery platform. All of that got provided in an instant. So so what I'm trying to say is that 13 years of this shift got accelerated for some people in the last 8 to 10 months. The other thing that happened, which is equally and much more important and less visible, is that back in 2007, there was this idea of, there's something called the cloud. Nobody understood what it was. There are movies where people don't, there are jokes about the cloud in movies because people don't are confused about it. But till 2010, 2011, people still thought of the cloud as a way to save money. They did not see it as a fundamentally new infrastructure for the whole world. So there was a lot of talk about cost of ownership of technology and so on. But 2011 onwards, we started seeing businesses investing in the cloud, whether to save money or not, but they invested in the cloud. Once they invested in the cloud, they moved their business to the cloud. That allowed their business processes to start talking to each other, which allowed much more coordination across the supply chain for different business processes to start talking to each other. So where we've reached today is that the architecture of business fundamentally is getting impacted. And this is why I wanted to build towards from something we understand to something more complex that's happening. That today you can take a bank and you can unbundle every component of the bank. You can take payments out of a bank and run a payments company. You can take lending out of a bank, run a lending company. You can take every component of the bank, unbundle it, create a new company around it. And all of this is possible because since everything is cloud connected, these various functions can now interact with each other, even if you specialize in just one thing. So what we're now starting to see is that the new bank looks very different from the old bank. The new bank, for instance, could be a company like Khata Book in India, or it could be a company like Shopify in world over, where Shopify is just helping you set up a shop, but it's also helping provide the loan to procure your inventory. So we're fundamentally now seeing this shift in business models. So again, I'll pause here. This got accelerated again because of the pandemic, because when people moved remote, when business processes had to be reconfigured, everybody who had invested in the cloud now realized that they needed to accelerate those investments and really think of new business models as well. So it's not just consumer facing things that have changed. The way the whole value chain works has shifted over the last 10 to 12 months.
Beautifully explained. In the last 11 months, some people called for the demise of the sharing economy, and it is going to at least diminish, if not. For example, let me give you two examples. The need for personal mobility is more than ever. Look at the sales of cars and two-wheelers in China. Look at the numbers rising again in India. We're still about 60, 70% of the overall sales. Then look at residential housing. For the first time, millennials spend more time in their home. So they understand the value of owning a home. They've also saved a lot in the last 1 year because they haven't gone out to restaurants, and Indians tend to save. So, give us a sense from where you coming from, working with CXOs, working with C-level leaders. Do you see any shifts in the sharing economy? I wouldn't want to use the word diminishing, but I would say shifts in the sharing economy.
Yeah, I certainly believe that there are shifts that are happening in the broader sharing economy. Now, I don't want to get into what is the sharing economy, what is not, because everybody has a different definition. But broadly, if we are talking about on-demand mobility platforms, if we're talking about companies like Airbnb and so on, if you think of all of these different companies, there's definitely been a shift. That does not mean that the overall value of peer-to-peer interactions has diminished. If anything, it has kind of accelerated certain things while impacting certain other things negatively. So even as international travel fell, a lot of domestic travel towards locations away from cities increased over the last 12 months. And so a new breed of platforms have come up that allow city dwellers to find experiences outside the cities. And the demand for that is increasing. That whole space was not as well organized in the past when the demand for international travel was much higher. So there are so one category I would say are new demand patterns are now leading to new types of platforms coming up for the first time. The second thing that's happened is there's been a lot talked about the death of the office space, right? But it's not really the death
At
of the
least
office.
at least the office space needs to reinvent itself to
Exactly.
something else, which is more than an office. So I won't use the death, but the way the office space exists currently, that needs to be reimagined.
Absolutely. So one of the things is that, what digital allows us to do is pre-digital, we used to just bundle everything together, whether, it's a bank doing 10 things together or it's an office being a place where you do 10 things. What digital allows you to do is it allows you to unbundle and recreate those experiences. So office, for instance, if I just think of the office as a bundle, the office is a place where you go to work, you go to have conversations around the water cooler, you go to play pool with somebody in the break, you go for brainstorming. Now all these four different things, your solo work, your brainstorming group brainstorming, meeting clients, conversations in the water cooler, they don't need to happen in the same physical space. They could happen across 5 different locations as long as they are connected and data rich and coordinated between each other. So as we move towards what we are now calling remote work, we'll really have to rethink this. Well, maybe there's a network of coffee shops that needs to be brought together, which could serve as the place where you have a meeting with the client. And there's another network of hot desks that need to be, that you can plug into where you go and do your individual work. So you reimagine your experience around unbundling the traditional office experience. And I think that's what we're going to start seeing happen more and more. You take anything, whether it's office space, whether it's financial services, whether it's what a hospital does, everything will have to be unbundled and reimagined. Like even if you take the hospital example, a lot of the things that happen inside a hospital can happen remotely at the home if you have the right diagnostic tools and services in place, and can happen with a distributed staff which is connected versus a staff sitting inside the hospital. So everything can be reimagined once we start thinking about what those old bundles were and how to rethink of these new bundles. That's where most business model innovation will happen in the next 5 years.
Okay, great. Sangeet, now let me ask you, when you write a book, every aspect of the book kind of comes together and it weaves a story, it weaves a message. There are different learnings, but, broadly it leads to, in your case, it's how to scale up. It's how to build platforms, so to say. But tell me, what is your favorite chapter in the book? And give us a peek into what is in the book. And if you have a copy of the book, I wouldn't mind you showing and holding up a copy of the book.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sangeet. Tell us what's your favorite chapter in the book and give us a peek into the various chapters in the book.
Right. So if you think about, the overall goal of the book is to help people understand that when you build business for the world of platforms, it's fundamentally different from how you built businesses in the traditional industrial age, which is what I call the pipeline model. And so what's different? How do you now think about scale? How do you think about launching, scaling, monetizing? Everything starts changing. And so the book is really about that. The book tries to give common economic principles, guidelines on how to design, how to launch, how to execute all of this. So my favorite chapter in the book is really one chapter called Emergence, which actually says that everything in the book you read will not help you. Okay, and the reason it says that is
read your next book.
Well, let me clarify what I mean by that. It basically says that no matter how much you design for these things, you cannot completely design them. So you need all of those concepts to design. You cannot just say, hey, everything is going to be about luck, or we'll figure it out. We'll jump off the cliff and we'll build an airplane on the way down. You can't, come at business with that. So what it essentially says is that everything you've read, it provides you all the tools to think about how to set this up. but you need to account for something called emergence. And emergence is different from luck, because when people can't understand something, they call it luck. Okay. Now, emergence is a
I call it
unique,
serendipity.
right? So,
And second thing, I keep saying, Sangeet, that the harder you work, the luckier you get. So, for me, luck is about action. If you take
sure.
action, you create luck.
Yeah. Yeah, happy to go into the topic of luck separately.
Yes,
it's a
go on.
topic
But
that's
when you're
very
talking
dear.
about emergence, the chapter emergence in
Yes.
platform scale, and
So
I've
the
not read
idea,
the chapter. I will read the chapter maybe tomorrow, but happy to chat
exactly.
with you on that.
Exactly. So the idea of emergence is that when you build a product, not a platform, when you build a traditional product, like, you build a book, there are only so many ways in which you can use it. You cannot create something completely new as a user out of the book. What happens on a platform is once a platform is provided, you can do things on top of it. So say Wikipedia is a platform, and I can go in and create new kinds of articles on top of it. Or if I take really a totally different example, something like Roblox is a platform for gaming, and I can come in and create new gaming experiences on top of it. Now, what that does is it allows for disorganization. Traditional businesses have been built around organization. This is how a process works. Make it happen 1,000 times. But when you provide something to users and you tell them use it whichever way you want, these are the things you can do with. Here's Twitter. 140 characters. The way Donald Trump uses it is going to be very different from the way somebody else uses it. So you're kind of completely spreading taking all of that risk of users taking the platform and doing whatever they want to do with it. That is emergence. So what emergence essentially says is that you got to think about all the design principles in the book, but even after you've done all of that, your users will surprise you in a way that they can never surprise you in a product-based business, because users cannot take the product and fundamentally extend the use case in completely new directions. I mean, yes, people take a washing machine and make lassi in it in Punjab, but that's, it's the exception rather than the norm. On platforms, doing that kind of creativity is the norm. And so the reason I feel the chapter is important is it says there's a lot to learn. This book provides a lot of that, but the most important thing is once you've done your best to structure all of this and put it to market, figure out how you're going to track what is happening on your platform and constantly feed that back into the future design of the platform. If you miss that part out, any level of theoretical rigor is not going to be enough. So you need both. You need structure, but you also need a tracking sensing mechanism. Sorry, Anurag, I think you're on mute.
On mute. I said emergence is a new way of looking at the same problem with an entirely new solution, having a context of the change environment, in this case, the post-pandemic environment, which in my own definition is defined by three simplistic things. One is we've learned to say, never say never, because there are a lot of unknowns. Second is less is more. And third is, the three P's beyond profit: planet, purpose, and people matter more than profits. If you take care of these three, profits will happen. But you're right, emergence is the emergence of a new way of looking at things, a new way of contextualizing, a new way of acting. And again, you're right. I want to tell you, Sangeet, last Saturday, I want to see a movie in a theater. There were 7 people. But the experience of seeing a movie on a theater is very different than seeing it in your living home. And both are not comparable. There may be similarities, but there are more dissimilarities. And I may say that the value of a theater experience goes up even more. I had the popcorn, I put up my legs, and it was very comfortable. And there is a certain impact when you see it on the big screen. Similarly, all major QSRs in Delhi created a bespoke experience. You could order food from there and it would come in a certain way. But the ambience that you get, the experience you get of going to a QSR. And my whole theory is, the beauty about digital will help you scale up. That's very clear. But how do you build a business model around it is a different ball game. Because some things, the physical world will allow you to build better business models, right? Now let me shift to some of the
if I can If I just add one thing on that, I think the key to building a business model in digital is to follow the data. It is, irrespective of where the experience is delivered, whether it's physical or digital, the key is to really follow the data. And there are certain extremely physical companies, like a tractor company that is helping farmers, mow their field and plow their field. That is extremely data rich. An example I use in the book is John Deere, and all their business models are now moving towards data. So it's really, if we do not make the distinction of data rich versus data poor, we end up missing where the value sits. It's always in the data.
I think data-driven business give you insights. Second is measurable impact, and third is possibly are more efficient. So you don't do spray and pray. You stick to, in most businesses, the cost of acquisition of customers is very high. So with data, you can minimize, and then you get new consumer insights, which either help you build a new product or improve your existing product. So clearly, data.
Absolutely. And in
works.
the case,
now, let me talk to you about other. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just adding one final line, that in the case of platforms, that inside of data goes beyond the company and affects the entire market. So it's a bit like, if you look at a traditional advertising company, it will use data for its own improvement. But if you look at Google and Facebook, they provide the insights to all advertisers all over the world, and everyone starts becoming better because of that, and starts changing their strategies. So it's the ability for a platform to inform the whole market. That's what makes it even more powerful.
Okay. Now let me shift to other chapters. Give us,
Sure.
Like you talk of emergence, and I'm very curious to read that chapter again. I did scan through it, but give me what are the other chapters in the book, and take an example of one more chapter and tell us why it's even more relevant in a post-pandemic world.
I'll just take two chapters at a very high level, and you can then choose to go down in one of those. So one is the first two chapters are quite important, where I talk about the shift in value because of the pandemic, and the fact that once you combine a demand side shift and a supply side shift, and you're able to harness it in the same business model, then you can become very powerful. And one example of that is, when the pandemic happened, we started ordering food online. So the demand shifted from the restaurant to online, but at the same time, the supply side shifted. The food does not need to be made anymore in a high rent restaurant in Connaught Place. It can be made in a dark kitchen in Pitampura or whatever, right?
You save on the real estate costs.
Exactly. And then when you combine the two things, the non-restaurant companies, which are doing food delivery plus doing this ghost kitchen in a corner of the town, they will always have better economics than the restaurant. And that completely, for example, shifts value. So that's one thing that I talk about. That's an interesting chapter. The other chapter, I would say, is actually the last chapter, which is very interesting, which says that the next 10 years is going to be about this tussle between openness and control, where companies will increasingly talk about how they are open and how they're saving the planet and how they are not evil, but they will figure out new ways to control you. And that's the fundamental essence of a platform economy. And I give the example of Google over there. Google has always said, don't be evil, don't be evil. Search is free. We don't lock in people like Facebook does, but there are a lot of things under the hood, which I'm happy to get into, which actually shows that all this don't be evil is just a story towards a strategic play, where you set up control points in other parts of the business which are less visible, which I can get into as well. But that's a very important aspect that I talk about in the book as well.
And if I may ask, Sangeet, now again, you cannot achieve a platform scale if your leadership is not right.
Sure.
Tell us, in a post-pandemic world, because you do work with CXOs, what has changed in the DNA of leadership? Does anything need to change, first of all? And if yes, what has changed?
So that's a great question, because we are now in the short term of the post-pandemic world. We have not seen the 5-year change that has happened. What has happened in the short term is that leadership in traditional companies is panicking even more, seeing this whole shift of value, at least stock market value, towards companies that seemingly do not deserve that value. But if you look at a lot of companies in the stock market, now whether they are valued correctly or not is a separate thing, but a lot of those companies which are valued highly at this point, there's also a high correlation with two things. One, they have a founding team which is still heavily vested in the company, so they still own more than 10% of the business, which is not the case with, say, a Fortune 500 bank, where the CEO and the top three people may not own 10% of the business. And two, that the the company has, because of a combination of there being a founding team and they having big skin in the game, the company ends up making long-term bets, which will play out not necessarily in 5 years, but in 10 years. And I think some leaders have panicked over the last year is because they've criticized a lot of these platform companies over the last 5 years, saying they are overvalued, but they realized that what's really happened is these platform companies were undervalued and they grew into that value over the last part of the last decade. So even if they seem overvalued now, what they were earlier was definitely not overvalued. So the point is that at this point in the short term, one is there's been even more resurgence in the fact that people believe in companies where leaders are vested. That's happening even more. Now, what that is kind of doing is it's shifting the narrative for how leaders should potentially be compensated in more traditional companies as well. What I've seen, a lot of new companies,
and Sangeet, just to supplement what you're saying, it's totally, there are entrepreneurs in the company, and they want to become entrepreneurs. So being vested in the company is very important to be able to cater to that need of being an entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
Both from value creation as well as from a strategic direction standpoint.
Absolutely, because all of this, so-called entrepreneurship, what happens at big companies, it's never going to make sense until you make long-term bets. It's difficult to build some of these kinds of businesses until you make a long-term bet. And you make a long-term bet if your incentives are aligned. If you are being graded on a quarterly basis and your bonus depends on what you did during the last 12 months, then you're not going to make long-term decisions. And so that's why a lot of innovation at big companies starts failing. What I've seen in the last 12 months is more and more of these big companies are starting to set up the internal innovation as independent entities and giving the people who run it, giving them big equity chunks in those businesses to really run it. And I think that's been a shift that 5 years back was not really happening. So big companies are also realizing this idea of being vested in the business.
Fantastic. Now, so clearly you're saying leaders have to have a stake in what they are doing. There has to be wealth sharing, there has to be co-creation, and more importantly, leaders also want to have their own imprint of what they believe should be the direction of the company. I think a lot of time it's about impact and not just about money.
Right.
The satisfaction of seeing an idea kind of from a child to become an adult and then start making an impact. My last question to you: if you had to make a couple of predictions about some mega trends that are right now very small, what would those be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, one of the most important trends that I believe will accelerate over the next 10 years is something I thought about recently. Over the last 10 years, most of the big companies that succeeded in technology and in digital, they all possess one common trait. They figured a way to create a bottleneck to the market, and then they charged a premium for that market access. So if you think of Google, it used search to create a bottleneck over the market. Facebook used a social network, and so on and so forth, right? So Apple, Amazon, all of these have aggregated the consumer side and then charged a premium for the whole industry to access them. What I believe is going to happen over the next 10 years, and especially the last thing that I earlier mentioned in terms of what has accelerated, the fundamental infrastructure of business is now shifting to the cloud. And when that starts happening, we're going to see a whole range of new digital infrastructure come in for all kinds of industries. Banks will have a new digital infrastructure at the back end. How you give a loan will depend on data that banks never had in the past. And whoever owns this infrastructure will have that kind of data. And there are companies that are doing this. Ant Financial in China is one such example, which has built very sophisticated credit scoring models and is providing that to banks around the world now. So companies that build this infrastructure with the brain at the back end for other companies, these companies will capture a lot of the value. And you see a lot of these companies in the market today. There are companies like Shopify, for instance, for small businesses, Amazon and Microsoft for the bigger ones. Lesser known companies like Unity, which is creating a backend infrastructure for gaming, but also for all kinds of 3D virtual environments, which I again believe will increase. So look for digital infrastructure companies. That's the one big trend that's going to happen. A second big trend that I believe is going to accelerate even further is everything that happened from 2007 to 2020 that I talked about. All of that got packed into 1 year for people who had never been part of that ride. So there are many other sections of society which have not been part of that ride yet, which are going to be taken for that ride in the next 4 to 5 years. Small businesses, Kinara stores, even those who have not yet been impacted in the same way. People who have latent skill sets. If you know how to teach something, the world is now available to be taught from a computer rather than you coming to their home. So
it's a do-it-yourself economy.
Right. So
teach yourself economy.
Right. And so it's this whole range of entrepreneurship, which is not the tech $100 billion company entrepreneurship, but literally entrepreneurship for everyone. That is going to be unlocked over the next 10 years. So companies that will do that will again capture huge value, and there are companies that are already doing that. So that's where I feel a lot of value will accrue in the next 10 years.
Okay, and I want to also ask you, although I said last question, I want to ask, in this increasingly technology world, what happens to human connection? What happens to physical touch? What happens to face-to-face? What happens to human interactions? So that's a big question, because at the end of the day, whatever you read, so I would want you to address that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my first point is that none of the points I'm making are about virtual versus physical. I mean, I'll just take this point opportunity to show the book. I did not write just an electronic book or just a video. I still, I personally like the smell of paper. I like reading a book like this, right? So my point is not about dematerialization. My point is not about physical versus virtual. My point is that the world will have to become organized in a different way. So my point is really about organization, how you organize things. Does the nurse have to be in the hospital, or can there be a trained helper at home who can do the job of the nurse? Does the measurement have to be taken in the hospital, or can you take the measurement using a diabetic meter at home, and then the data then be used? So I believe that the winners in this space are the ones who are going to use data in the right way to organize these ecosystems of people and processes, but are also going to empower the people instead of commoditize the people. And I'll just give a few examples of that. If you think of something like a ride sharing company, I'll just take an example, Uber, because I've actually done a lot of work educating governments about how to regulate Uber. And one of the key points over there is that Uber actually commoditizes the driver, because the Uber prevents the driver from setting the price, and you as the buyer do not care who the driver is. So the driver has now become a commodity. It's a commodity behind the Uber application. So we need to build ecosystems and experiences where people are not commoditized, but they are empowered. They're empowered towards new entrepreneurship. They're empowered towards new opportunity. And that, I believe, is really where the real value will come out of all of this connectivity. And when people are empowered, and a lot of the basic processes, a lot of the factors that empower them are already embedded in technology, their learning curve goes down. They are able to focus on what makes them unique. And that makes the interaction with people then also all that more important. So what I believe is that if a lot of this automation and absorption of value into technology is done the right way, it should not commoditize people, it should empower them. To do that truly, to do that really, really well, we fundamentally have to make one shift, and that is we have to change our education system. And that's the biggest problem, because the education system is still building people for the different world, not one where they will be empowered, but where they will fit into traditional roles. And that world is gradually going away. So if the education system continues putting those kinds of people out, they will increasingly get commoditized. So we need to really change the education system, change the risk environment, and then the value of these platforms and digital technologies will become much more powerful.
Okay, that's fantastic. There are some comments on the chat. Let me see.
Sure.
So I'll take one or two questions. Why are B2B, Ganesh Natarajan is asking, why are B2B platforms still reluctant to use multi-tenancy platforms? Sandeep Nandra Jog is asking, is only complimenting, but we'll take Ganesha's question. And then there is Ramnath Subramaniam. In your book, you gave the example of Washington Post's ARC platform. Do traditional publishers have specific advantages that platforms don't have? So we'll take these two questions.
Yeah,
and
sure.
The last one is Rohit Suresh. At some point, could you please touch upon how demand-side dynamics could counter the chasm we're seeing between above the algo and below the algo?
Okay.
He's talking about algorithms.
Yeah, I know. Looks like somebody who that.
There's a new lingo you got to.
Yeah.
So at some point, could you please touch upon how demand-side dynamics could counter the chasm we are seeing between above the algo and below the algo workforces?
Yeah. No, that actually.
First, Ganesha's question.
Okay, let me just switch around and go in random order. So because I remember the last question best, I'm just going to start over there. Okay, so what's happening is that what he means by above the algo and below the algo, which is terminology I used in my recent report that I brought out, is basically the world is seeing an increasing inequality between people who code the algorithm and people who get controlled by the algorithm. And so that's the above the algo versus below the algo workers. And essentially, Uber is a classic example. If you sit inside the company and you're a developer in the company, you probably own millions of dollars in shares and you control the algorithm. But if you're a driver, you are being paid minimum wage and you're being controlled by the algorithm. So that is a fundamental inequality that we are shifting towards in this kind of an economy. What is there are, I would say there are two or three things, when we apply the demand side effects logic, there are two or three things over here. One is, how do we create optionality for people who are participating on these platforms? Because let's say those are the ones who are below the algo. The above the algo people who are actually building the platforms, they have a lot of optionality. I work on Twitter today. I'm a great developer. Tomorrow I get taken into Facebook. The day after I get taken into Apple or whatever. If you're below the algo, the only way you can create career success for yourself is by not being overtly dependent on one specific platform and its algorithms, by having work across multiple platforms. And in order to do that, you need to choose your platform very carefully. So be very clear about, whether if you're joining a certain platform, is it going to control you? Are you going to set the terms? Are they going to set the terms? That's something that's very important. The second thing is constantly keep upskilling yourself so that you can change, you can offer more and more things, and be able to participate across a wider range of so-called freelancing on-demand work, if that is where you are going. So I think that's it's easier said than done, because a lot of people
it's also the mind shift of the leaders. I think it requires a change in the mind shift of employers, which will possibly happen gradually.
Yeah, I think a lot of that mindset shift has started happening over the last 12 years in particular. If you see one specific instance of a new trend that has taken up in the last 12 years, you'll see the rise of companies doing remote payroll, basically payroll for remote employees, which was not happening in the past. So today you can just go to any of these companies and hire anybody anywhere in the world without having to worry about the legal implications or the workforce implications of the country, because they've abstracted it away from you. So a lot of those things are beginning to change, which is why I feel that if I go back to that earlier point I was making, The next 10 years are going to be about creating optionality, creating entrepreneurship among all these free agents, right? So that's how I see the above the algo versus below the algo distinction for these, and how to choose how you shape your career. The other question about, Washington Arc's platform, I believe the question was, um, how are
Are there
traditional.
other how what are the advantages it curves, and are the other publisher using such platforms?
I think it again goes back to, I
Basically
think
asking about the advantages. What are the advantages that other
yeah,
publishers can benefit from?
right. So if you think of the publishing industry, again, I think of two types of players in this increasingly concentrated economy. There are players who control access to the market. So in publishing industry, that's Facebook and Google. And then there are players who provide the infrastructure for you to run your own business. And Washington Post's Arc platform is one such infrastructure, that if you want to run your own paywalled content, if you want to charge subscription for that or charge pay-per view for it, all of that can be done based on just one single platform. And it's not just Washington Post. If you look at a Norwegian company called Schibsted, which has been incredible in terms of transforming to the platform economy, they also have a very similar set of infrastructures that they provide to publishing companies. So in all these cases, the advantage to the publishing company is, one basic advantage is you get the tools to manage your digital assets. The second advantage is that as more and more publishing companies come on board, start using it, it captures data across the market and is able to better inform you about, say, how you run your campaigns, how you think about marketing and so on, what kind of content works versus not. And over time, once you created a whole network of publishing companies using your infrastructure at the back end, you can then connect them in many other ways. You could provide them, demand side advertising platforms that could publish, so that they can publish their inventory across many different ad networks. You could provide them, you could provide a common identity management system, so that if I go to a certain publisher and log in using my Washington Post ID, I could then go to many other publishers. They don't do that today, but they could do all of that going forward. So that's how I really see that evolving. The final question, I think, on B2B platforms, we're starting to see the rise of B2B platforms in a big way only in the last 3 to 4 years. And there's a reason for that, because a lot of B2B platforms work in processes further up the value chain. And what happens over there is a lot of those processes were not digitized. Now, there are two specific factors that led to that digitization. One is, which I talk about in the book as well, there's a chapter on the rise of B2B platforms. One has been just the shift to cloud has created that kind of collaboration power between different processes, which allows different companies to start coordinating around a central platform. And the second is just digitization because of sensors and other mechanisms. So a very good example of a B2B platform, for instance, is Autodesk, which is creating the Autodesk Construction Cloud. So Autodesk provides you the tools to design a building, but what it now does as a B2B platform is that you can design the building. Within that building model, you can simulate different materials and figure out which materials work best for the building. And then you could take the whole simulated model, provide it to a construction manager, and he can just procure the materials right on the platform, organize the workforce right on the platform, and manage the whole building project over there. And once the building gets commissioned and becomes operational, actual data from the building management system can feed back to this model, so that you can constantly see if the building is performing in the right way. So that whole thing of organizing the industry around a platform is, these are the ways in which B2B platforms are kind of coming to the fore as well. So yeah, I believe that over the next 10 years, that's going to be another big area.
Thank you, Sangeet. I think you answered all the questions. I think we should do another conversation when I've read the book fully.
Sure.
I did read most parts of it. And, I'm a book alcoholic, so I read books once, twice, thrice sometimes. Yeah. And, sometimes the concepts are, kind of very relevant to a certain segment of what you're doing. It may be that one thought process that you're able to use and implement, which makes the process of reading not only rewarding in the way that you learn knowledge, but in the application of it. So I'm sure platform scale will add to not only the knowledge, but the application, We wish you luck, and hopefully we can do a physical conversation with you soon, either in India or Singapore. We wish you luck. We'd like you to show the copy of the book. Those of you who missed the conversation, please watch it on the BW Business World YouTube channel, or read it in the next issue of BW Business World. The book is Platform Scale for a Post-Pandemic World by Sangeet Paul Choudary. Sangeet has impeccable credentials. He studied at IIT Kanpur, went to another revered IIM, and has worked in Singapore, advised companies, now works with individual and corporation in helping them transform and advises them on strategy. So clearly somebody who understands what's happening in the business environment and what is needed in a post-pandemic world. So thank you, Sangeet, for talking to BW Business World. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And I look forward to reading the book again and implementing some of it in my own area of expertise, which is content and building business models around content. And you know that the media industry is getting really transformed by tech, and the media players that are successful today are the ones that embrace data and technology in a much better way.
Right.
So clearly that's the way forward. I look forward to engaging with you soon enough. All the best for your look. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anurag. Thank you.